Hi, Manjul. Thank you for joining me again today. So, today we're going to talk some culture. Tell me a little bit about why this became a subject you wanted to talk about.
Yes, so today we're going to talk about stories that are similar across cultures and how that came to be. The inspiration for this episode was from reading my daughter's Bible books. So, my daughter, who we joke as we're raising her as a Kathindu, my wife's Catholic, and I grew up in a Hindu household. So, we have books from like different cultures in our home and we read to her. And as I was reading, and I've taken some religious studies classes in college, but reading Bible books, I was struck by the similarities of some of the stories I grew up with in Nepal and those mentioned in the Bible. So, one particular story that triggered me to or interested me to do more research or be fascinated by this was that the story of Moses' birth and that of Lord Krishna in Hindu mythology. Both of these stories involve babies who miraculously escaped tyrants who were set on killing them, and both of the escape route in both cases was being put in a basket and being floated down the river. And this made me wonder, like what other stories are there that are similar in different parts of the world? How has this been possible? This plagiarism of some sort, when unless Moses and Krishna had Instagram handles and shared their stories, I don't see how this happened. So I'm just curious, what is your take on this? Like, why do you think these similarities exist?
So, when I hear about similarities between European civilization and Indus Valley civilization, cultural stories or mythologies, I think back to their population histories. Although people may not know this offhand, or it may seem surprising to some people, the population histories are recently shared. So if you go back 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, there was this group of people that lived north of the Black and Caspian Sea. They were called the Yamnaya. They're a ghost population, so they don't exist today in unmixed form. But the Yamnaya, they were a pastoralist culture, and they migrated many different places. So they migrated west into Europe, but the same group also migrated south and east into the Indus Valley, and they contributed significantly to the existing populations that were there. So there were different existing populations in Europe and in the Indus Valley. So they're different mixtures, but this migration brought the Indo-European languages and presumably a package of cultural ideas and stories as well with it. And so there's been this similar contribution of population to both areas. So a connection to me isn't super surprising. Now, sorting out all the details and where each single story arrives from, or each single word arrives from, and its particular history is super complex, but at least on that scale, I think we can see that there's going to be some similarities because of that shared history. Also, there are just some human universals. I think we see in some mythology human universals bleed through too. So we could essentially pick any culture at random and we can find some stories that are shared across the board. So that's my take on it. I don't know what you think about that.
No, yeah, and there's always a possibility, it seems, that it could simply be that through human experiences, although it's uncanny, it would be a little uncanny for it to be so similar, right? Like there has to have been some kind of trade or stories. Back in the day, I used to teach SAT, and I used mnemonics. I used to tell my students, you watch a 3 hour long Bollywood movie once and you'll remember it for years and years. You're looking in the rote learning, memorized based learning that tends to happen even when you're trying to memorize something that is academic or textbook based. People struggle. So clearly there's something about stories that fascinates humans, and the ability to retain and like recall, even when people hang out to this day, right? Like with a beer in the backyard fire, people are talking about stories, right? Generally they're talking about anecdotes that stuck with them, and then maybe next time someone else makes that their own or draws parallels with their life and then says it. And so I see that happening even today in our circles. So it's not in that sense, like as long as people were able to do that, of course the means of transportation were not the same that are today, so it would have been harder, which is what makes it interesting. You brought the Indus Valley civilization. There's like a Bollywood movie I watched called Mohenjo-daro, which shows the similarities in two cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and how their urban planning is very similar. And even back then, they standardized the brick sizes, which is how you know, okay, there was some kind of standardization across the two cities.
Yeah, it's amazing going back into the past and seeing how history unfolded and the connections between things that we don't think are connected. It was both unsurprising and surprising in different ways. The connections between the European population history and then the population history of the Indus Valley. All right, so I know today
Yeah.
you wanted to test me a little bit on proverbs from your background and see if they made sense to me in any way. I know the different cultures have these constructions in language, like the French people famously call people like my little cabbage is the direct pronunciation. It's like a pet name. But and just like in general, there's idioms in different languages all over the place that just seem like very alien to someone not of that space, but are very familiar to someone who's from that background.
Yeah, definitely. Somewhat alien reminded me of the fact that when I first came to the US, there was actually a assigned alien number for me. I think this should be fun for our listeners. My American wife has always enjoyed me bringing Nepali proverbs and literally translating it for them, and she has got a kick out of that. So, since our stories tend to be similar, just like you guys have the boy who cried wolf, we have the boy who cried tiger. So maybe because of climate or geographies, maybe we didn't have wolves that high in Nepal. So like, we have boy who cried tiger. So it's very interesting being in a cross cultural relationship. Some of this figuring out the similarities, differences, and ultimately at the core realizing we're all like not trying to be cheesy here, but humans and what drives us, the want or desire to gossip is similar across in societies. We used to think, oh yeah, white people are naive, like they don't gossip. They gossip just as much, if not more, as we want. We Nepali people like to do. So that's how the idea for the proverbs came to be, because it turns out throughout history these proverbs have been passed down as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a fun little segment here where I literally translate a Nepali proverb pretty much word for word in English and see if you can guess what the meaning might be. And then we'll dig into what it actually means, and if there's an actual English proverb we can draw parallels from. Start with the easy ones. You ready?
Shoot.
All right, first one. Better a one-eyed uncle than no uncle at all. What do you think this means?
I mean, it sounds like just being happy with what you have. It's better to have something than to have nothing.
Yeah, so like, can you think of an English proverb that could be very similar to this?
Yeah, the obvious one that jumps to mind is, of course, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Wow, okay, you got it. I guess we did say we'll start with the easy ones, but yes, there you go.
Yeah.
See, right? Like Nepali, we say Nahunu mama banda kano mama niko, means better a one-eyed uncle than no uncle at all. Sounds funny. I feel like this could have been put in so many other ways, but yes, we got this. And there's not much, I guess, to unpack here. That was the easy one. We'll go to the second one. Eating the sweets of the mind with ghee.
That one's like a little metaphorical or something. I'm not sure. I mean, I know what ghee is. I'm familiar with what that is. But the sweets of the mind with ghee, I'm not sure. That construction's a little confusing.
So the English equivalent would be don't count your chickens before they hatch. So the sweets of the mind is like you're making this all up, and not just making it up, you're eating it with ghee. So you're
Okay,
basically counting your chickens before they hatch.
I see.
All right, we'll move on to the next one. Curd does not set on the palm.
Well, this seems to be referring to like it takes a good amount of work to accomplish something good. So like it doesn't just happen.
Wow, I am impressed. I am actually very impressed because I can see myself in your shoes not knowing a clue what this means. So that is true. Can you now draw a English proverb that could be considered close to this?
I think there's like many different ones. I'm not sure like one that jumps to mind, but like there's many
How
different
about
ones.
how about Rome wasn't built in a day?
Yes, yeah, that's a good one for that.
Yeah. How many days was Rome built in, by the way?
I don't know, generations probably, right? I
I know, I
mean,
looked
I'm
it
sure.
up. It's 800 years. I'm like, come on, you could have said built in a year, built in a decade, built in a century, but really wanted to drive the
Uh,
point home, it seems.
yes,
The next one
gotta
I'm
be
very
really.
proud of. Any Nepali
Yeah.
listeners listening would love my translation here. The Nepali proverb goes, Bhai phute gawar lute. So it rhymes in Nepali, but I've made it in
Uh-huh.
such a way that it rhymes even in English. So it's brothers fight, neighbors delight.
Mm, okay. Sounds like a little bit of a recognition of Schadenfreude, which is like
Elaborate, yeah.
is the feeling of glee people get when they see other people having a rough time. This isn't necessarily specific to that.
It's
Um,
very, yeah, very close, and you're not wrong. It, yeah, basically means, so it almost portrays, that's where, like, I think deeper cultural, like, norms or like goes into, is like your neighbor is supposed to be your friend, so why are they delighting when the brothers are fighting? And it's because they
mhm,
like to gossip, so it's a gossip material for them to go discuss
mhm,
in the village in a tight knit society, is,
that's
I
right.
think, my interpretation of it. Besides the fact that, yeah, like if you view your neighbors as someone who not well wishers of yours, which I hope that's not the case, and like internal conflict is like, if we like for right now, if Americans divide between themselves, it's neighbors here, as in like, thankfully our neighbors generally friendly countries, but neighbors as in for other countries, it should be opportunity. So that's what I think it means. Ready for the next one?
Got it. Yep.
This one I will give you two translation. First I'll make it literal, and then like maybe do with a little bit better English. Elephant inside, tail outside.
Uh, I don't understand that one at all.
Exactly. I will now do it in proper English. The elephant got through, but the
You have to
tail
give me
got
more.
stuck.
Elephant inside, tail outside. I mean, the elephant has the tail, right? So I don't understand.
So I'll give you a better, longer phrase, like elephant. Okay, one
Yeah.
proper English version here. The elephant got through,
Yep.
but the tail got stuck.
Oh, okay. Which doesn't really make sense physically. The elephant got through, but the tail got stuck. I don't know. Is the elephant the fun part, but the tail is like the not fun part? So, but like, uh,
Mm, Not
I don't know if I
necessarily.
get it.
So what this is getting at is describing a situation where someone successfully completes the major difficult task, but then gets
Okay.
stuck or faces trouble with a minor or trivial issue. So it highlights the
Okay.
irony of being able to overcome significant challenges only to be hindered by something small and
Mm-hmm.
seemingly insignificant. This is one of my
Right.
wife's favorite. This comes in different situations. Like one one situation is when we're gifting, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
or going to someone's wedding, where we bought the tickets, we've booked expensive hotels, we've taken vacation days, we've done everything around to be able to attend someone's wedding. So then, like, to cheap out on the gift doesn't make sense, right? That's where elephant inside, tail outside, like, is one way you can think of it. Is you've done
I
all
see.
the other major expenses, now in relation to all of that, the gift is like a trivial-ish expense. So like, let's not
Mm-hmm.
cheap out on that. That's when, like, she will go, oh, let's not do elephant inside, tail outside. That's one example. um I could probably
Got it.
think
Got
of
it.
many others. So this one is a regular in our household that we use to convince each other. Just like, oh, we bought a nice home, we have this. So now let's not go with a cheap XYZ, whatever. So like, this has been my wife's weapon to justify any medium expenses once the big expenses are done. She this is a if she I don't think she'll ever get a tattoo, but if she ever got a tattoo, I think there could be this could be portrayed in a depiction or word for word. She loves this one.
Got it. It's her mantra.
Yeah, or like, it's her way to negotiate with me. She's a wonderful person.
Yes. Yes.
She is like the best in negotiations.
Of course.
We're watching this show called The Diplomat right now in Netflix, and like, I could see
Okay.
her negotiating tactics being much better if she only tried it at a different
Mhm.
There's no winning here.
Right,
There's
right.
just not losing and postponing. But anyways, last few ones, I guess, moving towards the tail end of this. In
Yeah,
monkey's
yeah.
hand, coconut.
In monkey's hand coconut. I don't know. Is a good thing? I mean, is a monkey gonna throw the coconut at me? I don't know. Like,
So if you have never been to Nepal, but those who have know that there are like in the capital city around the temples there are these monkeys everywhere.
uh-huh.
So the proverb, so the referenced monkeys basically is getting at the importance of wisdom and understanding in handling valuable things is not the same for everyone. So it's a reminder that not everyone is equipped to handle every situation or resource. So
Mm.
in that sense, the coconut could be a good thing, but the monkey has no use for it because it doesn't know how to break or consume it or make something out of it. I also these kind of things also like are used a lot in political context and everything around that. So this reminds me how proverbs can be used humorously sometimes to
Mm-hmm.
point out someone's ineptitude in a lighthearted manner. So it's like it makes sensitive conversations is useful to get around that by a touch of humor. So that's another way like proverb is sometimes used, like this versatile way of using these things. So turns out this one I was like trying to draw parallels if there were anything like that. So it turns out there is. I don't know now that if I've given the explanation, can you think of
Mm-hmm.
anything in like English that's similar?
Not exactly, because in Anglophone cultures, I feel like there's so much of a desire to be like egalitarian, at least in spirit. This one seems noticeably inegalitarian.
I see what you mean. No, I
I'm
don't know
not.
if it is,
I'm
but
not
I
sure if
can see
it's.
how it could
Yeah.
be perceived like that. Okay, yeah, I see. So it turns out there is one though saying, and it says cat, and this could be British. I don't know. You tell me. We'll have to dig deeper. Casting
Uh-huh.
pearls before swine. So apparently, it's a
Hmm.
biblical reference. This phrase
Yes.
originates from the Bible, specifically Matthew 7:6, where Jesus advises his followers not to offer sacred things to those who will not value them.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
and that's an interesting comparison in my mind, because it seems to, in this case, the inegalitarian nature of it is wrapped up with like sacredness or sanctity. It seems,
mhm,
there's this contrast here in that idiom between what's sacred and what's
yeah,
profane potentially, especially given
yeah,
the biblical source. I do agree that there's some parallel there for sure.
yeah. Well, hope our listeners are having fun with this, but we only have three more to go here. The knife does not know the pain of the chopping board.
Well, I mean, the knife's not sentient, right? I mean, but I mean, what it refers to, like, it's like a perspectival thing. Like, you don't necessarily know the consequences of your actions on other people, right?
Yeah, close. I'll give you that. So that one is, yeah, those who cause harm are often unaware of the suffering that they inflict. Um,
Hmm.
for our Nepali listeners, it's achanako pir khukurile jandaina. So instead of knife, that was my translation for you. The saying actually uses kukuri, which is a Nepali weapon. That's what made the Gorkhas famous all over the world for their bravery.
Hmm.
Something our listeners, if they're interested, can look up. Sometimes tourists who go to Nepal would bring a very handicrafted, nice cookery for display in their home as well. Um, second to last one that I have here.
Hmm.
A dog hit by a stick is scared when lightning flashes.
It seems to be a nod to psychological behaviorism. Have you heard of B.F. Skinner and Pavlov's dogs? It's
No,
the
elaborate, yeah.
condition. Okay, in psychological research, is a famous experiment where this scientists would have dogs, and they would ring a bell and then present food to the dog, and they would measure, when they do this, how much the dog would salivate, and then eventually they would just remove the food stimulus and just ring the bell, and then the dog would still salivate. And this would be an example of conditioning a behavioral response or a physiological response on a stimulus that's not necessarily directly related to a stimulus that should cause that response.
Wow, wow, wow. I mean, you're
And
teaching me
so,
about my own proverbs here, and maybe that's fascinating because you're kind of on point. Like, the meaning for me was past traumas can cause fear in similar situations. So maybe there's a book in the
right.
making. Maybe there's a book here where we title it Nepali Proverbs and Their Deeper Meaning.
There you go. Yeah.
Maybe people were more profound than what we took on, and like, yeah, so very, very close, or like at least from my perspective. But yeah, I learned something there too. Last one.
Hmm.
No matter which monk comes, his ears are always pierced.
Okay. I don't know anything about Nepali monks. Are they like? Why would? What does ear piercing even signify? Like, I don't know.
So
In
yeah,
this
exactly. So
context.
the pierced ear symbolize a common trait among monks, regardless of their identity. So traditionally, many monks in South Asian cultures, including in Nepal, have pierced ear as part of their religious or cultural practices. So the
Okay.
proverb uses this imagery to convey that certain characteristics or situations remain unchanged no matter who's involved. You could say this in the context of, oh, no matter which senator gets elected, no matter which senator comes, his ears are always pierced. So basically
Mm.
saying that some situation remains same no matter who's in charge.
Mm. I see.
Yeah, so
S-
it's like highlights the inevitability of certain
Yeah.
traits or outcomes, regardless of who is, at the helm. So that's basically what I had for this segment. Unless
Cool.
you had anything to add here, but that was fun for me. Hopefully, it's fun for you.
Yeah. No, I like the folksiness of proverbs and sayings and idioms, and there's a lot of interesting things there. I wish like I knew like a great catalog of sources. I sometimes casually search for them and I haven't found anything amazing. So
Yeah.
I would love to
Well.
be pointed to a really great one, because there's a lot
Yeah.
of like there's a lot of regional ones in America. There's some really
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
interesting and bizarre
I
phrases.
bet
So
nothing as
I want to
interesting
track
as
them
elephant
down.
inside, tail outside. So if you don't
Yeah,
take
yeah,
anything else away, elephant inside, tail outside. Let's make that famous. Anytime you
yeah,
podcast listeners see each other, our core
you
should
know,
be, hey, elephant inside, and the other guy says tail outside. That's how you know you listen to the same podcast.
yeah. There you go. Yeah, that one was super opaque to me. I would never be able to guess what that means.
Not anymore.
No.
That's why
Yeah,
it's the
now I
perfect
know.
one. That's why it's the perfect
Indeed.
one to be used as a secret code or something. Maybe next party you have somewhere, like the code should be the guest says elephant inside and you say tail outside.
Indeed. All right. So I did have some questions. I did have some questions that I wanted to ask you, just kind of about Nepali related things. Just from my background, my provincial background as an American, and I just wondered
As
what
a
you could
weird
tell me
guy
about
is
these
what you
things.
mean?
Yes, as a weird. Yeah, we'll jump into like what weird means as an acronym. Like lately, that's become a very popular acronym to describe Western culture and why it is the way it is. Because in a lot of ways, like the only a small percentage of the world is quote weird,
Yeah,
but
why don't you explain before
a
we
lot
go
of the
deeper?
people that
Like, give the
fill the
so weird
space with
stands for
ideas and so on.
so
So
just
weird means
yeah
Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And this emerged as a criticism of research, saying that most of, especially psychological research and cultural research, sociological research, it's conducted on a lot of the times college undergrads from American or European schools. And this represents a type of ascertainment bias, because most of the people in the world don't fall under or don't live in weird societies. And so we didn't necessarily have a great grasp on the totality of human psychology and human social organization because of this ascertainment bias in the research. And so there's been a renewed effort to understand those differences. For instance, one of the big takeaways of the recognition of weird was that, we've always thought, or not we've always thought, but psychological research has argued that there are 5 dimensions to human personality. The
hmm
abbreviation for this is OCEAN. People can look up the 5 different dimensions. And when they've studied non-weird societies, they found that no, they can't find the 5 personality dimensions. They only find like 2 dimensions. And so what we thought was universal, for example, is not. And so academic research has gone around and trying to debunk a lot of things that we've thought are human universals and so on, and showing that there's a lot of different, idiosyncrasies and a lot more complexity in the ways humans behave than we thought. But in some respects, I kind of think that we're overly hard or overly persnickety about debunking these universals. I think sometimes there are universals that we're erroneously dispensing with, but that's a side note. In general, I think there is something to this idea, and coming from a weird background is definitely going to shape one's psychology. Things like believing in romantic love, for example, is something that's in some ways peculiar to someone from a weird background. It's not as common in non-weird places,
as opposed to being okay
and
with
so this
being
gets
married in an
like
arranged way
arranged.
in that case. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah. Yeah, and that's one example of the weird versus non-weird distinction.
Yeah.
And
It's funny. I think
so
you and I
based
have
on
talked
this,
about this, by the way, on the fact that it seems like it's very arranged here in a sense that the places you meet people, you have basically arranged it so that you're meeting people like you or people that you're seeking in terms of, we talked about, I think, in the past,
yes,
wealth-wise,
yeah,
even like you don't see as
mhm,
many, you would think in America, you would see much more like cross-racial marriages and all than maybe see, or that's
right.
still like observational, and that clearly is not. So maybe America is secretly into arranged marriage. They just like to think they have control.
Well, I think what we'd see, my comment on like mating in general, is that there is this pretty strong preference for assortative mating in some ways, just non-random mating. Whatever social dimension is deemed relevant in a certain context, the people making mate choice decisions are going to be making those decisions on a particular trait basis. And so like in our weird societies, a lot of the times it's social status, which is like a mixture of how educated you are and how wealthy you are, how much charisma, how much riz you
Yeah.
have, Manjul.
Yeah. Yeah, we're trying to attract a whole
Yeah,
new demographic to our listenership, looks like.
we got to get the Zoomers to listen.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I did have a question though about some myths, like we had talked about. There's a lot of shared stories, so I figured that Nepal had like hero myths, just like Western cultures. Western cultures have our heroes. Like, I mean, we can name really kind of like middlebrow or lowbrow ones, like like Superman and Batman and so on. But I figured, I was interested in terms of hero figures. Who does Nepal have or identify with, for example?
High level, there are some soldiers that and this is a word I struggle to pronounce something, but some war soldiers like who fended off the British attack in Nepal. Again, referring back to the kukuri we mentioned. So
Mhm.
those are the heroes. One that I will
Mhm.
share a little bit more in depth maybe is Nepal's Mulan story, right? So like if you've watched Mulan,
Okay.
like
Yes.
Nepal actually has a real life Mulan story where this woman named Kirti Lakshmi defends the town of Kirtipur, which is where I'm from the siege of Prithvi Narayan Shah, who's the first king of Nepal. So he annexed or conquered smaller states and made Nepal, which is already a small country, but that being said, there were multiple kingdoms that he basically fought and won and unified the country. So he himself is like the father of the nation. So he's viewed as a hero. But in Kirtipur, this lady disguised herself as a man and fought to defend Kirtipur. So that's another, since we're talking about cultural parallels, again, Nepal also has its own Mulan story. So Kirti Lakshmi is a hero in the eyes of many as well, especially those who live in Kirtipur, which
Mhm.
is a unique town in the outskirts of Kathmandu, the capital city.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting. And I guess in terms of like what's the main medium that just in general that mythology is transmitted in Nepal? Is it mostly like through some sort of written way, or is it mostly oral, or like how is it transmitted in most
I
cases?
think if you go to the temples like of Nepal, these stories are depicted in the temples, like carved into wood,
Got it.
and all that. I don't know if that's the main necessarily, but that's definitely a one way to
Hmm.
how they have lasted centuries.
Got
That's
it.
one.
Got it.
And then oral tradition is very like strong in the sense of families getting around and in the villages, and the elder of the village, like maybe reads the story to the all the village children. Similar
Hmm. Hmm.
bedtime stories notion, and of course there is the
Hmm.
written documentation, but that is probably more in modern times.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's something called the Western canon in literature, and the Western canon is the literature that we deem to be representative or emblematic of being a Westerner. And it would start with heroic poetry from ancient Greece, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it would run through the literature of ancient Rome and run through Anglo-Saxon culture up to Chaucer and then Shakespeare and then on and on and on to
Hmm.
more familiar literary figures. And that this has often been identified as this is the cultural repository and philosophical repository of Western ideas and Western culture. And people see there like a continuity in the West. And I'm not sure if such a thing is there the same sort of continuity seen between different Indus Valley cultures, or is it a little more fragmented, a little more diverse? What would you say?
Ooh, that's like I don't know if I'm necessarily the right person for this exact question that you're trying to ask or you asked. I think there's similar,
Mhm.
like again, I'll give my best effort answer here. Don't quote me on it. Like there are like you know s-
Uh-huh.
Asia as a whole, if you look at it, there seem to be some things that are similar depictions. Especially like Buddhism is one interesting one, right? Like Buddhism started. Buddha was born in Nepal. In fact,
Right.
my grandfather lived not very far away from where Buddha was born. Um, that place is preserved, is a tourist destination in Lumbini zone of Nepal. There was a big controversy, or like once in a while, India tries to like again like this muscle it and try to change the narrative there, and like the fights on oh Buddha was born in Nepal and all that. but
Mm.
but that being said, Nepal is predominantly a Hindu country, although a secular one, and there
Right.
haven't been any major or even like minor, to the extent what is considered minor religious fights or conflicts in Nepal. Is very secular country where people enjoy like facets of Buddhism. Like I'm not a Buddhist, but I have statues of Buddha in my home in America.
Mhm.
So and then you can find emblems or symbolisms of Buddhism in like countries that are not predominantly Buddhist, but then other countries somehow ended up being, even though it was started in Nepal, let's call it, and then like he found enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, which is currently, I believe, in which is modern India, and yet those two countries are predominantly Hindu countries. So there has to have been something where
Mhm.
others picked it up, right? Like, and I know there's some stories, I'm gonna butcher the name of the architects, like where there were exchanges with China, where a Nepali architect would go to China, Chinese architects would come to Nepal. So there has to have been some kind of exchange and similarities between the cultures and countries there for it to flourish in the region elsewhere than where it was predominantly started, is what I'll say. And there are like some other similar artifacts that that you could look at and be like, oh, this is similar to whenever we travel. We'll be like, oh, this is similar to what we have, all that. But yeah, again, like I'm skirting a little bit around because I'm not necessarily like very well versed in the Indus Valley civilization. But if you look at religious
Yeah. I mean,
practices and all, the similarities show up in like pottery styles, from like basic things like bead making, metallurgy techniques,
right.
even the importance of water in
Mhm.
certain rituals in various cultures. You see that in agriculture, in the
Mhm.
cultivation of crops, that like
Mhm.
similar crops, domestication of animals. Those are the things like you can like point and be like, oh yeah,
Mhm.
this is like there has to have been some kind of aha moment that like then like word spread and like was adapted and like then modified over times to suit for the different environment or different cultures, but like the birth of it has to have been in like one place.
Yeah, and then my last question in this realm, sorry, this is like really off the cuff, is that a lot of is made of Eastern and Western cultures being more collectivist versus more individualist, respectively. And do you think that was something you experienced in Nepal, or is something else happening?
In that, like, can I like just ask for clarification in that, like, the society is viewed as a
Yeah.
unit and like, but you know, in the Western culture too, it says it takes a village to raise a child, kind of is how I'll start, right? Like that is an English saying.
Mhm.
Definitely took my mom sometimes tells my wife the story of how I was raised because she was working then. How is that possible? And it actually took a village. There's picture. I mean, it's gonna sound ridiculous, but there are pictures at which point like we're like 26 some people helping with different things.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that's the line of your question, but yes, I do definitely find that, especially again, like tying it back to somehow we always bring this up in that sense, like being a recent dad, we moved states to be closer to family.
Mm.
So there's some element here, but that still being said, I don't know if it's a function of being a little bit. Yeah, definitely. I do think, okay, like I'll answer the question face up, straight
Mhm.
up is yes, I do think as a whole, from what I know of Indian culture, what I've seen and lived of Nepali culture and other South Asian cultures from having friends from the area, I do think that's still a more tight knit society than the West is. We lived in New York, we lived in Chicago for years, and we did not know who our next door neighbors were at times, not always, at
Mhm.
times. That would never
Mhm.
happen in Nepal. That would absolutely never happen in Nepal. I don't think that would happen in India, you know, like, and like, when one thing I say to friends is like, when I meet a South Asian in America, and especially a Nepali or Indian, it almost starts with friendship, and then something bad has to happen or something the vibe has to. We assume we start with like we're going to be friends assumption. Whereas
Mhm.
when I've seen two non-South Asians meet, it starts with being two strangers, and you have to build up to the friendship. It's a
Mhm.
higher bar. It's just like less likely to happen. Seen it very close and in college, in business school, and all that. It can happen, and when it happens, the strength once it happens, then the strength is pretty much similar. I don't think there's any like discrepancy saying like, oh, best
Mhm.
friends in South Asia are more deeper than here. I don't know if that is necessarily the case. I do think the society here is still more individualistic. I'm not saying that's a good or a
Mhm.
bad thing. Um,
Mhm.
I guess on the margins, maybe it's like if I had to say good or bad thing is I tilt towards bad in the sense that I do think humans as a whole are like people who like we as humans need society, people. You've talked about this in the previous episode. Even raising family is one of the main purposes of life. Is I think how you put it. I don't want to put words in your mouth. So similarly, like if everyone does that, then the society as a whole becomes one big family and all that. So I mean, all things equal, I do prefer a tight knit collectivism over individualism. Not that you asked me which I prefer.
I think I was just trying to understand what your experience was, if it did indeed feel like the culture in which you were raised was significantly more close knit or collectivist than
Yeah,
what you've experienced in America
yeah,
after you left.
yeah. And certainly
But
was, and
yeah.
I wonder if it's because I wonder if there is a function like you might be able to answer this from a little bit far distance perspective. Is like not everyone would be self-sufficient. Maybe resources were limited. Maybe like I do remember the time when my grandfather was the only one of two guys in the village who had television when it first came. So that became kind
Mhm.
of a like he would put on like the 8 o'clock news for the whole village. Whoever wanted to come could like he would put the TV
Mhm.
out, could come and see watch it. Maybe another guy can then
Mhm.
invest in some other technology instead of buying a television. Maybe the resources are limited, and he or she
Mhm.
decides to buy a mode of transportation, and the village can use it for their purpose when like in case of emergencies, or buy the fuel and use it. Maybe
Mhm.
someone else buys the fridge. Like sitting here in America today, like it sounds ridiculous, but I've seen that a little bit firsthand as a kid. Resources are
Right.
limited. You can only have so many luxury items in a way, and so like if you're a collective society, everyone kind of benefits. And
Mhm.
maybe those the lack of availability of resources made people need each other more. This is completely guesswork on my part, by the way.
Mm-hmm. I think the research would say that there's something to this. I mean, so the weird researchers, the big one in the field is this guy named Joseph Henrich. He was the one behind pioneering the acronym itself, I believe. He argues that the reason the West became so weird is that the Catholic Church in medieval Europe worked really hard to break up tribal alliances, large cousonages by essentially preventing any marriage among relations. And so it really lowered essentially the relatedness of the overall society. And so there was just fewer connections. People over time became more individualistic. There was other things that happened downstream of this, of course, but that was the initial mover. And then what this did is it breaks up this lower scale cooperation that you're talking about, where you have these really close communities that share resources, but then enabled this large scale cooperation where we're building major city states, we're building nations, we're building world economies from that. And so there's this tension between cooperation on the small scale versus cooperation on the large scale. And one of the examples that you'll hear is people will talk about nepotism, for example. So there may be more nepotism in a closer knit society versus a less close knit society. And so in the West, we'll label it as corruption, whereas like people in a different culture may look at nepotism as like this is doing the right thing, for example.
It's funny you bring that up because definitely seen that as well. Definitely been a hindrance to the development of our country, the nepotism in which people can just appoint their relatives to different positions. I was shocked, to be honest, though. Like, I do think this happens a fair amount in America, just in a different way, right? Like alumni networks, I think, are a way of like nepotism in their sense, like maybe not direct, like literal word for word nepotism, but in a way you are promoting people with your affinity, presumably because it's self-fulfilling in a way at times. So that's that. And then not pointing fingers anywhere, but I know places where like the interns are basically employees' children, and maybe they're just as qualified, and no problem with that. But there are leg ups even in America. Either way, but like despite being a South Asian, there's so much cultural differences intra-country, let alone inter-country, that until recently, and you brought this up, that's why it triggered something in my mind. It's only like a couple years ago, and I tend to talk with my Uber drivers whenever because we're there, and like, why not? I think we can learn from every single person, from their experiences. Everyone's living a different life, and you can get the highlights. Why not? So I strike conversations anytime I'm like in an Uber or something. I learned from one of my Uber drivers that he was Pakistani, and he was mentioning about how in Pakistan, for almost 50% of women married, their husbands were their first cousins. And like 8% of them were second cousins. So like that was shocking to me. Like in terms of when I am talking about like tight knit society, that would never fly in Nepal. I don't know if it would fly in Hinduism in a way almost. So that was news to me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that is something that I was aware of. Obviously, being a geneticist, we pay attention to places where consanguinity, which is basically the rates where there's some breeding between related people, are high. And Pakistan is especially notable for their rates of consanguinity. So that observation, although is probably very surprising to a lot of listeners, is very familiar to me too.
And if not, so that we learned from these that not only that our past like share some similar roots, like it always the message takeaway comes out to be cheesy when it comes out of my mouth, and sometimes when I hear it myself. But there's more that unites us than divides us, like our roots. If you've listened to episode 2 of this podcast, if you've not, definitely recommend that. Like we originated from the same place, different things happened for us to today look different, talk different, but at the same time have so many similar like ways of thinking, being. And this is just another example of how even our stories and takeaways tend to be same. or like have similar roots. So hopefully, like, it was a fun episode for everyone where you learned something out of it. I certainly did while researching for it. But yeah.
Indeed, I'll put a lot of information in the notes today just to provide more context too for this discussion, and just a little bit of the history, because there is so much there. Culture is very complex, but it's also sort of the human superpower. It's, at least a lot of people think, it's responsible for a lot of the great accomplishments of the human species. And so thanks for talking culture with me today, Manjul, and we'll be back for more interesting conversations at another date.
Thank you.
Bye.